I just want to introduce Jamie briefly. So I met Jamie in May last year in Tel Aviv, Israel, where I went for a conference. And among many people who were present in the conference, I met Jamie at the lunch line and we talked over lunch. When I found out that he was a Messianic Jew, I was almost moved to tears. I felt that God was showing me his salvation work through Jesus follower in the land of Israel. Jamie will share his testimony today, so we will learn about his life more fully, but I just want to give brief introduction. Jamie became a Messianic Jew Christian in his senior year of high school through the influence of his friends and a high school Christian organization. In his early career, he worked at the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, eventually serving as chief counsel to a U.S. Senate subcommittee. However, he wanted something more, so he did his study at Messianic Jewish Seminary and became a rabbi and led Messianic Jewish congregation called Tikvat Israel, which became one of the flagship congregations in the Messianic Jewish world. He also served in a leadership role at the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. In 2011, he moved to Israel, and he has been serving Messianic Jewish community in Israel, teaching the Bible, leading prayers. He currently works as a Messianic Jewish lawyer, and his wife, Stacy, teaches piano, guitar, and English. So please welcome Jamie.
Just don't want to go too long here today because, when you share your story and you're my age, the story gets long, right? So I just, wanted to keep it short. I'm going to time it so make sure it doesn't go out of control. And thankfully, on May, I already shared part of my testimony, so I can cut it also a little bit shorter, which is also great too. And it's wonderful to be here. My wife and I actually grew up on the other side of the river. So we're very familiar with this area. And, so anyway, it's just a joy to be here. So as far as my story goes, I was born in New York, but we moved to Washington, D.C. when I was very young. My father was involved in politics from the very, very early age, as far back as I can remember. And that was the kind of family that we grew up in. I would say I was Jewish. It was a Jewish family. We weren't super religious. We went, it was a little bit later, around 9 or 10, we joined a synagogue, and we were there pretty regularly and went through Hebrew school, which is the way you are trained to prepare for, the Jewish life, and what's called a bar mitzvah. It's kind of the transition of life from a boy to a man. But anyway, but again, we were not that religious. And so after many years of Hebrew school, in which was expected for me to go up to the age of 16, I finally said to my parents, it's just getting a little too much after 6 years. And because, all my friends, they're out playing ball and everything, and I'm stuck in Hebrew school in the afternoons after regular class. It was a little bit of a bummer, to be honest. But so anyway, what ended up happening is I kind of considered myself an agnostic. My father was an atheist. So everything was fine. And then I met, when I was in high school, I met a Catholic girl, and we started dating, and she invited me to come to her church. Now, I'd never been in a church before. And so I went to this church, and she started telling me about Jesus and about this person who, walked on water and changed, water into wine. And I was like, really? Does anybody really believe that, anymore? And I just thought it was like preposterous. But anyway, it was, so, we went a few times to the church, but it actually just honestly kind of reminded me of the synagogue. The only difference was, because it was a little bit boring, but the only difference was there was a cross with a guy on it, because, in the Catholic Church, they actually have the crucifix with Jesus actually on the cross. So that was about the difference. But it was through her that in my senior year, that I met some really born again Christians. In fact, the person who really helped lead me to the Lord We're going to see him tomorrow for the first time in 50 years. So it's really amazing. I haven't really been out of touch with him. And anyway, I went, he invited me, it was through the Young Life organization. Some of you might be familiar with it. He invited me to come to these meetings. And I was like, I really am not that interested. Not religious. And I had tons of religious training. And besides, I'm Jewish, and Jewish people don't believe in Jesus. So he kept persisting. He said, no, you should come. It's different. It's unique. And I thought, well, this is the late 1960s. And I thought, well, everybody's supposed to have an open mind. So this is okay. So I'll just try it out. And so I remember going into this home of one of the fellow students that was just jam-packed with other kids. And as soon as I crossed through the threshold of the door, I could feel there was just something different. I didn't know what it was. Looking back in retrospect, clearly it was the presence of the Lord, but I didn't know that. And so I walked in, and they were singing a few songs and did a skit or so, and then the leader got up and started talking about this man named Jesus. Now, I didn't know anything about him, never really had heard of him. I grew up in a very, very Jewish area in Silver Spring. And the only non-Jew in our neighborhood was an Italian family that lived across the street. That was about it. So anyway, but I was really intrigued. And so afterwards, I decided to go back and continue coming from, week to week, just because there was just something there that, I didn't have. And it wasn't like I was like this. I was into all kinds of, junk and stuff, but I wasn't really searching for anything. Wasn't really looking for any change in life. But there was something there. And finally, the Young Life leader gave me a New Testament for the first time and asked me, to start to read it. So I knew I brought it home, and I knew if my parents found it, I would be in deep trouble. So I kept it hidden behind my books in my bookcase. And then at night I would pull it out and started with Matthew, started reading straight through. And I was like, wow, who is this guy? It's like the things that he says and the things that he does. It's like everything that I was really looking for in life, even though I wasn't really seriously looking for anything. It was like he had the answers for everything. And so over time, I began to believe, and my life started really changing. Like I said, all the things that I've been doing before, I just gave up. No one even told me that what I was doing was wrong. It was just like, I didn't want to do them anymore. That's just the way it was. But now the issue was, who am I? I figured I was the first Jewish person in the world that ever believed this. See, no one told me that Jesus was Jewish. All of his early followers were Jews. The writers of the New Testament were Jews. I didn't know that. I figured Jesus was the first Christian. He just popped down on the earth. And after that, everybody else are Christians. That's just the way it is. So it was like, what am I? And because Jews are, I believe God's created Jewish people to have an innate connection to their own heritage, to testify to the faithfulness of God from generation to generation. So, again, struggled with this issue until I went to college the following year. And at college, I met another Jewish believer for the first time, who explained to us that at that time we were called completed Jews, now Messianic Jews. And he shared with me from the scriptures, from the Hebrew scriptures, about all the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah and how Jesus had fulfilled these prophecies. And now we're like, Messianic Jews fulfilling what God intended to do among the Jewish people. So I was like, wow, that's amazing. And now I have a way to kind of explain this to my family now, because they were suspicious that something was happening, but I had never really talked to them about it. And so now I was like, now I had a way to explain it to them. So I still remember going back to my home on a school break, and sitting down with him. I said, Mom and Dad, I have something to tell you. And so I began to explain about, my newfound faith. Well, all I can say is the good news was not good news to them, So within 30 seconds, my mother was weeping immediately. My dad started screaming at me, and then he broke down and wept. And then for the next several years, there was just, a lot of tension. I mean, we still maintained relationships, but several years later, actually after Stacy and I were married and we had two of our children, they cut us all out of the family. and I was considered dead for 30 years, almost 30 years, until a miraculous restoration and reconciliation just before they died. And my father came to faith right before, and it's an amazing, it's an amazing story, which I don't have time today, but I don't like these cell phones and prefer watches, but anyway, whatever, there he goes. So, so anyway, that was that. And from there, I went from college to law school. I went from law school, worked in Congress, as Young May said. I basically served primarily in the U.S. Senate as chief counsel on a U.S. Senate subcommittee. And I was, my boss was the assistant majority leader, the majority whip of the Senate. And so I was his counsel on leadership matters and so forth. But during that time, we started a Bible study in the Senate for both Senate and House staff, and so we had a number of staff from both the Senate and the House, and from both political parties. And so my only rule was, and so it was like a 50-minute Bible study in the middle of the day. So my only rule was that politics had to stay outside the door. When they came in the door, no more discussion. And for these people, that's their life. Politics is their life, But the issue is that Jesus' ways and his kingdom is supreme, and that is what has to be most central in our lives. So I just taught the scriptures. We had a time of prayer for one another, and that was it. And so that was what I did for the last several years while I was serving in the Congress. And then we really felt like God was calling us, into the ministry. We were really praying. And the Lord opened the door to go to a Messianic Jewish seminary, which was in the Rockville, Gaithersburg area, which is where I went. And we eventually, after we graduated, moved to Richmond, Virginia, where we took over a fledgling Messianic congregation down there in like 1990. And it was a great experience. In fact, two of our members are here, believe it or not. The part of the Cruz family. They're sitting back there. And they lived right across the street from us, believe it or not, and they and their family were members of our congregation for many, many years. And so we were there for 22 years. It was a tremendous time. Our girls grew up in that congregation, and we had built just tremendous friendships. We grew a lot. We saw a lot of Jewish people come to faith, and it was a controversial congregation because Messianic Jews are controversial in the Jewish world. And there's tons of stories I could tell you, but I don't have time to get into that. But in the midst of this period, our middle daughter decided she wanted to study abroad in Israel, and she eventually made what was called Aliyah. The word Aliyah in Hebrew means to go up, and it's the word basically for immigration for Jews to Israel. So if somebody immigrates to Israel as a Jew, then they make Aliyah. And so she decided to do that in the year 2003. And it was during that period that Stacy and I began to discuss the possibility maybe someday of doing the same thing, which was, it's a big deal, right? Many of you, I can tell, some of you are immigrants or from immigrant families, and it's hard to move to another country. I'm also an immigration lawyer like Jan May, and so I know, we know what it's like. But anyway, so we started to discuss this, but then our second daughter, our oldest daughter, moved to Israel, or tried to move to Israel, and she was blocked because she was a Messianic Jew. So she basically became like an illegal immigrant there for like 3 or 4 years. And while her case went through the court system, because in Israel, any Jew can become a citizen of the nation of Israel unless they believe in Jesus. That's it. If they find out that you believe in Jesus, you're barred. And so they discovered that she was, and so she was barred. And she became part of a Supreme Court case that was finally decided. She was one of like 12 other Messianic Jews, and they actually won the case. And were able to ultimately get citizenship. And it was shortly after that case was decided, that Stacy and I decided to come and visit her, and also to consider making all ourselves, immigrating ourselves. So we came into the airport. This was like in December, I think, of 2008. And we got to the airport, and they go through immigration, and then the person's on the phone for a little while, and then all of a sudden, in Hebrew, the person says, "I need the Ministry of Interior." And as soon as they said that, I was like, "Okay, we got trouble." That's just trouble. And so the next thing we know is that we're being pulled into another office, being interrogated by Ministry of Interior people, and then they show us this like decree from the Ministry of Interior barring our entry into Israel because the last time we'd been there, we'd been, quote, illegally involved in illegal missionary activity, which was completely not true, but regardless. So anyway, then they say, okay, well, we're not going to be able to allow you in, and we're just going to take you to a place where you can rest. And then, you probably have to go back from where you came from, because we went through Germany. Of all places, we have to go back to Germany. So, so anyway, we're taken along in this bus, and we end up in a jail. So we're like at a detention center at the airport. And there we sat for, several hours. And then again, it's a long story, can't get into it, but by the grace of God, we were liberated out after some political people got involved and helped us get out of there. And we had to sign some kind of silly waiver. And then the Jerusalem Post discovered it, and they wrote a big story about everything that happened to us. So the idea of actually, immigrating to Israel after all this publicity, negative publicity, was not going to go so well. So anyway, we came back to the States, and we changed our passports and everything, and then ultimately 2 years later, we put in our immigration papers, and they just went right through. They never figured it out that we were the same people. These notorious people that were coming in to destroy the country. But anyway, so anyway, so ultimately we, immigrated to Israel in the year 2011. And it was, we gave our congregation in Richmond about a 3-year kind of heads up, because, it's difficult. I was like the founding leader, and it was a large congregation, and it was going to be difficult. So we prepared everybody, and then we moved. And it was a shock to the system. These were our closest friends. We'd walked together for many years in the Lord. And the question was, now, what are we going to do? What are we going to do in Israel? It's like, we don't speak the language. Yeah, of course, we can read the Bible and, the Bible in Hebrew and the prayer books and stuff, but it's a big difference between that and speaking. And so I really felt led of God to go back and continue working as a lawyer, as an immigration lawyer, full-time. And so ultimately, we formed a law practice in Israel of all believers. It's the only all-believing law practice in the land. I mean, there's others who are Messianic Jewish lawyers, but we're the only ones. And that had the entire firm. And so Stacy went back to she's going to choose a piano teacher, and she was teaching piano. And so we ended up buying this place in the Jezreel Valley. And the Jezreel Valley, it's also known as the Valley of Armageddon. So we used to say to people when we come back to the States, this is where we relocated, and we're happy to rent out rooms for the final battle. So anybody wanted to visit us. And so that was what we got planted. We got involved, and we got involved in a congregation in Haifa, Israel, where Deborah's from. And so we're involved in, Stacy leads worship in different ways, in different prayer meetings. I've taught some classes and lead different things. That's our involvement. And so and all of our children are there. Our grandchildren are there, 7 grandchildren. It was all really great. And then October 7th, tomorrow, a year ago. So it's emotional. So it was a Saturday morning. Of course, for Jews, we worship on Saturdays. And we were getting ready to go to service. And all of a sudden, we were getting phone calls from our daughters who live outside Jerusalem that there were bombs, rockets falling all over the place, and they were running to shelters. Now, it does happen from time to time. in Israel, there's rockets or whatever. But this time it was a ploy, to allow Hamas to kind of, under the cover of this rocket invasion, to invade the country unsuspected and to do just a complete and total disaster. It was at that point, we didn't know what was going on. We came up to the congregation, and then everybody's on their phones. They're figuring out that there's a lot more than just a few rockets falling. The leader gets up, says by that point, that morning, 40 people had already been killed at the border. That's just the beginning, and then the country goes to war. It was at that point that our daughters decided they needed, for their safety and their children's safety, to leave the country. And so we wrote a email letter to my email mailing list to everyone to raise funds to be able to move out of the country temporarily. And, because we'd met Jan May, several months before, and she was now on the mailing list, and all of a sudden, bam, all this money comes from your church. And we just, I can't tell you how thankful, for our family's sake. And my daughter said this morning, because we're with her up here, to thank you personally for your assistance at a crucial time. And they left for 3 weeks to Germany to be protected. And then they came back. And then, as Israel attacked Hamas, the bombs started lessening, wasn't as bad. Where we live in the north, so we're not too far from Haifa. So, and the bombs from Gaza they don't reach that far, generally speaking. So we were pretty well protected and stuff during most of this period, but still the war has just been so devastating. What happens in Israel is, they have an active military. Every Jew has to serve at least about 3 years in the active military, and with the exception of the ultra religious. And but then once you finish serving your 3 years, you have to be in the reserves for 20 years. And so in a lot of ways, it's different than the American military. And what happened in this case, because of the disaster, is that they called up tens of thousands of reserves. These are people who are in their 30s, have families, they have jobs. They've been fighting in Gaza and elsewhere for over a year. I mean, it's been the country, aside from what happened on October 7th and following, it's been just traumatic. I mean, the country's in trauma, if you can imagine. And, it's hard to believe, the United States, the last time there was a war on this land was in the Civil War. So, yes, 9/11 and yes, Pearl Harbor. But it's not like Mexico's firing in missiles every now and then and we're getting attacked by Canadians. It doesn't happen here. And so it's been very, very, very traumatic. And I would say in the country, there's about 20,000 Messianic Jews in the country now. That number has grown dramatically over the last number of years. Of that number, 1,000 Messianic Jews from Messianic Jewish families are fighting in the war right now. And and some of them have been killed. So it's really been, like I said, very, very traumatic. The rest, the Messianic congregations throughout the land, have really tried to provide as much help as they possibly can. They do a lot of humanitarian work, bring in the soldiers, the active duty soldiers, they're well equipped, but for the reserves, there's usually not enough equipment for them. I mean, there's weapons, but protective equipment, there's usually not. A lot of the Messianic congregations, including ours, have raised money to be able to provide for protective gear, provide for food, which is not adequate, and provide for all kinds of things. Also, there's about 100,000 people that are dislocated from their communities, especially from the north, because once the war started, Then the Hezbollah from Lebanon started shooting rockets and became the far north of the country. It's a little bit north of us. They had to evacuate. They've been living in hotels around the country for a year. So there's just tremendous dislocation, and that things have just, kind of gotten worse and worse. And then, interestingly, what happens is that in Israel, Israel has a lot of agriculture and stuff, but most of the workers, the agricultural workers, are foreign workers. Like from Thailand, other places like that. They all had to leave, and so when we hit harvest time, there was like no one to harvest, and all this stuff could just rot out. So a lot of the Messianic congregations gathered together, sent people in. They invited in Christians, and so a group of Christian farmers came in from the United States who were experts to help in the harvesting. I mean, this is the way. It's ultimately a great witness to the nation of Israel for both the Messianic community and the Christian community at large to take, to support the country at such a disaster, such a difficult time. I want to get ready to close and just say this as far as prayer. The greatest thing that Israel needs is a revival. It's interesting that when we were invited by Pastor Ho and Yon May at their house for dinner the other night, and have all Korean food, which is just like spectacular. And their little turtle is named Revival. And he's been praying. He said he's been praying for revival. It's interesting in the scriptures, in the book of Ezekiel, it says that the Lord will return the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. In fact, there's more prophecies about the restoration of the nation of Israel and the return of the Jewish people back to the land of Israel than there is about the Messiah in the Hebrew scriptures. And so Israel's restoration is a fulfillment of prophecy. But the scripture says that God needs to change the hearts of stone into hearts of flesh. And there are a lot of hearts of stone. But, there's, again, 20,000 believers, Jewish believers, among 6.2 million people. Tiny proportion. There's got to be a change, and it must begin with revival. That's our greatest prayer, is that through this, that people would seek for something beyond some of the religious traditions and look for a different answer, for Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah, as being the answer. And then also, lastly, just to pray for protection for the country. I mean, things have just really, it's gotten worse. What's happened to us is that, with the whole pager attack, which I'm sure everybody read about, the pagers blew up and all this Hezbollah hands, too bad, but anyway, but that caused Hezbollah in Iran to now get involved in attack. And of course, the north, where we live, has now come under attack. So we've had to run to shelters on all of our phones. There's like what they call a home security command, where when rockets come, you get this warning, this really horrible signal comes, and you have 1 minute to get into a shelter. So we have one in our home, thankfully, just down the stairs on the first floor. But a lot of people they're like in the basements of apartment buildings, and so it's just chaos. And so we really need to pray for protection of the country and for peace. God wants peace. His ultimate goal on the earth is peace and justice to come over the earth through the rule of Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah. Thank you.